Okay, so this is the review sheet for respiration. We're going to go through it now and go through the answers to explain some of them for our revision. So if we zoom in, we've got the first thing we need to do, we need to write down the word equation for aerobic respiration. So if we remember, aerobic respiration is when we have oxygen, we have enough oxygen, so it's when we are at rest. So we need glucose plus oxygen, and we make carbon dioxide, water, and we make energy. Then where do we get the reactant from? So our reactants are what two react together, so there are glucose and our oxygen. So we get our glucose for food and drinks. If you remember, glucose is just our scientific word for sugar. Then where do we get oxygen? We get oxygen from the air that we breathe. We just breathe it in every single day as we're sitting there. Then we need to look at the word equation for anaerobic respiration. So that's when we haven't got oxygen. So that would be during exercise mainly, when we're not getting enough oxygen around our body. So we still have glucose because we're still eating food and drink. But the glucose is broken down incompletely into lactic acid. And we still make energy, but we make a lot less energy than we would in aerobic respiration. Then it says, what does the word oxygen debt mean? Oxygen debt is the oxygen required to break down lactic acid. So after you've done your exercise, you've got a massive buildup of lactic acid in your cells. So what happens then is when you stop doing exercise and we start to get enough oxygen around the body, it's the oxygen we use to break down the lactic acid before we can aerobically respire again to then produce carbon dioxide and water. Then as we go through, we have our respiratory system. Okay, we haven't got to do anything here, we just need to be able to label it. So are we able to label our mouth cavity and our nasal cavity, so our nose and our mouth where the air comes in. Then we go down to our trachea, which we can see labelled here. Then our trachea splits into a bronchus or bronchi, because we have a left bronchus and a right bronchus. From the bronchus then, it divides into smaller airways called our bronchioles. At the end of our bronchioles, we have our alveoli, which you can see here, and we'll talk about further along. We also then have our lungs, we have our ribs. In between the ribs, we have the intercostal muscles, which we look at during breathing. And then we have our diaphragm, which we also look at during breathing. So let's look at the alveoli. So what's the function of the alveoli? Well, the alveoli is needed for gas exchange. It is exactly where in the lungs gas exchange takes place. So the adaptations of an alveoli, I've written them down here. It's got a thin wall, so it's only one cell thick. So it's got a short diffusion pathway. We have a close blood supply, so every alveoli is surrounded by a network of capillaries. And it also has a large surface area, so it's like this broccoli cauliflower shape, because it will increase our surface area to allow more diffusion to take place. So how does it work? So when we breathe in, oxygen comes down from our bronchiole into our alveoli. When we've got lots of oxygen there, we have our blood capillary that's coming around. That blood capillary has got a high concentration of carbon dioxide because all the oxygen's been used in respiration is coming back to the lungs. So what happens then? Oxygen will diffuse into the capillary. And the reason that is, if you remember what diffusion is the movement of particles from high concentration to low concentration. So we've got a lot of oxygen inside the alveoli, not a lot inside our capillary because it's full of carbon dioxide, so the oxygen diffuses into the capillary. At the same time then, as our capillary is saturated with carbon dioxide and our alveoli has got more oxygen than carbon dioxide will diffuse out of our capillary and into our alveoli. When we breathe out, our carbon dioxide will leave. Right, now let's look at breathing. So what happens when we breathe in? Nice steps for us to remember. When we breathe in, our intercostal muscles, they contract. Okay? And as they contract, they force our ribs to move up and out. If you take a deep breath in, you will feel your ribs move up and out. At the exact same time, our diaphragm will contract and flatten. Okay, and it contracts and flattens because it wants to increase the volume in our lungs. It increases the volume so we can get as much air in as possible. As the volume increases, our pressure in our lungs will decrease at the same time. With that happening, air is drawn into the lungs because the pressure inside the lungs is lower than what it is outside of our body, so air is drawn into the lungs. So it's the exact opposite for expiration. So if I had to have them both here so we can see, when we breathe out then, our intercostal muscles relax, whereas they contracted in inspiration. As they relax then, it causes our ribs to move down and in. Obviously, if you take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, you'll then see your ribs go down and in. At the same time then, our diaphragm relaxes and domes, so it's in that dome shape. As you can see, if we go back here, that's our dome shape. That's our dome shape. Okay, so if we go back, at the same time then, because it domes then, our volume inside the lungs is going to decrease. And then as that decreases, the pressure inside our lungs will increase, so air then is forced out of the lungs when we breathe out. And we're going to look then, what is the function of the mucus? So mucus, remember, is all the way down our trachea and is part of our ciliated cells. And the mucus we have then is used to trap dust and germs in our throat, so down our trachea. When we breathe in dust and germs from the air. Okay, it's inevitable. And then what's the function of the cilia? As we know, we have ciliated cells. If I draw one very quickly, let's see if I can. So our ciliated cells, they're cells with our tiny hairs on, as you can see. So there's our cilia. Okay, and then what happens then, that those cilia move back and forth, and what they do then, they bring that mucus, that dust and those germs from your throat back up into your mouth, and then you will involuntarily swallow, where it goes down to your stomach, where it gets dissolved by your stomach acid. Where are we going? Okay, so what can smoking do to the cilia then? So the cilia, the tiny hairs, the smoke then can paralyse, or essentially they burn the cilia, so they're really, really short or they don't move, so it causes the smoker's cough. So as they can't beat back and forth, they can't bring the mucus up to the throat, so it just sits there, and then we get the inevitable smoker's cough. They've got to cough it all up. What other illnesses does smoking cause? Well, it can cause cancer, one of the main ones. It can cause bronchitis and emphysema. And if you remember, emphysema is the breakdown of our alveoli. It breaks down the walls of our alveoli and they lose their elasticity. So their surface area decreases rapidly. So someone with emphysema would have shortness of breath. And then last bit, look and explain how the bell jar model works. So the bell jar model is used to demonstrate breathing, is to look at how we breathe in and out. On the bell jar model then, we have a rubber sheet, and that acts as our diaphragm. It's on the very, very bottom. And then we have our bell jar, which represents our ribs. As we pull the diaphragm down, okay, the rubber sheet down, air is drawn in through the Y-shaped tube, which is represented by our trachea. As the air is drawn through the Y-shaped tube, it's connected to balloons which then inflate as air goes into them, and our balloons represent our lungs, and vice versa. We can do it for breathing out. If we push the rubber sheet up, it's going to force air out of the balloons through the Y-shaped tube and out, which will deflate our balloons. What are the problems with the bell jar model? So there are limitations to it. The actual bell jar in itself is glass and doesn't move. Okay, but the bell jar is meant to represent our ribs, and as we know in breathing, when we breathe in or out, our ribs will move up or out, or they will move down and in, whereas our bell jar doesn't actually move. Our diaphragm then, so the rubber sheet, we need to pull it down for when we're breathing in, but when we breathe in, our diaphragm actually flattens. But we've got to pull it down, so it's not a true representation of what happens to our diaphragm when we breathe in. And that then, zoom back out, is our respiration review sheet. Hope it helps.